going to go ahead and get started. So thank you guys for joining. I know a couple more of you guys hopped on. We are going to do this live. This is our first go at this. So we'll see how successful it'll be. Hopefully it'll be really successful. But we're here with Dr. Lockwood, and he's going to kind of walk us through the vines. So let's get started.
Well, good afternoon or good morning, I guess still, but it's a beautiful day, and we're with Walt Chisholm today in his vineyard, and so we're going to look at a few vines and talk a little bit about canopy management techniques. Walt, I guess one of the first things I'd like to do is know a little bit about your vineyard and also as we go, the different varieties and so what they are and why you selected them.
Well, this variety here is the Chardonnay. It's one of the first vines that we planted here. We planted 3 varieties to start with: Chardonnay, Traminette, and Marquette. These vines are about 15 years old. This is a white variety and got hammered pretty good with a spring frost this year, but it's come back and made a pretty good crop.
Oh, good. But it's certainly a good-looking vineyard, and the color of the foliage and the growth is pretty good. We've had a nice growing season for the most part so far, and crop-wise, yeah, there's some nice fruit out there. So, a little bit about the vineyard itself. Your rows here are basically oriented north and south. Is that correct?
They're north and south. They run parallel to the property line. Perpendicular to the property line, and we have probably 17 different varieties. Some of them we just have small quantities of them to play with to see if we like them and they like us.
Right.
But we have an Arundel here, which is a virtually disease-resistant grape. We don't spray it for anything except insects. We have Aramella. We have the Chardonnay. We have Traminette. We have Chamerson, which is the workhorse around here. We have Port Nord. We have Regent. We have Villard Blanc, and we have Noray.
Okay. Yeah, so you've got quite an assortment of hybrids and American hybrids, as well as some others. But with the vineyard, and you hit, I think, on a real important point. As you go across Tennessee, there's a tremendous difference in the growing conditions that we see from the valley around Knoxville, the plateau, the Highland Rim, Interbasin, and West Tennessee. And so it really is to your benefit as a grower to have your own mini experiment station to see how a variety performs under your management and your soils, and not take the word of somebody that may be several hundred miles away, because there are vast differences. I believe at one time you'd mentioned that with Chardonnay, for example, which was developed in Cornell, if it wasn't for the work that was done in other states like in Indiana and Missouri and so on, that variety probably never would have been released, or at least it would have been longer.
Didn't do well in New York, but it did great in Arkansas and Indiana and those states.
Yeah.
It does well here.
Yeah, so it's very beneficial to not necessarily commit a lot of resources to a given variety, but certainly to have some to get a feel of whether it'll fit into your program. And we're going to talk a lot about canopy management, but canopy management actually, there's a long-term view, and then there's a more immediate view. And when we look at the long-term view on canopy management, we're looking at what type of grape are you going, what variety, what's the growth habit of that grape, what are your soils like? You happen to be on some very good soils here. I know we've talked about that before. So that would impact the spacing. What trellis design are you using? Those are all going to be factors that will have a definite impact on the canopy management. As we get in on more immediate things, we're going to be looking at things like leaf removal, non-fruitful shoot removal, shoot positioning, maybe even somewhat on crop thinning. So those are the things we'll talk about a little bit today. One of the things to keep in mind in growing fruit, and it's any fruit crop or really any green crop, we're doing whatever we can to intercept sunlight. And growing a fruit crop is all about sun. We've got to have different levels of sunlight to get fruit bud initiation for the first thing. And remember in grapevine that somewhere around the time you see bloom this year, fruit bud initiation for next year's crop is starting. And if you've got a real dense canopy, you don't get fruit bud initiation in those heavily shaded areas. So fruit bud initiation, as we develop the crop, the better sunlight, air, and spray penetration you get, the better off you are as far as controlling diseases. Sunlight, I think, is as a natural pesticide, because the quicker the fruit and foliage dries off after a rain event or a fog, the less chances you have of disease development. And of course, the more open the canopy when you spray, the better coverage you're going to get. We also need to have certain levels of sunlight for color development in the fruit, for sugar development in the fruit. And so canopy management can become a real important thing. If you're growing grapes for wine, it's to your advantage to have as much uniformity in the development of the crop as you can possibly have, so that when you go through and clean pick an area, you've got a nice consistent quality to deliver to the winery. And so some of our canopy management is going to be directed towards maximizing quality, yet protecting some of our vines. And what we do in canopy management, I mentioned earlier, on the short term, we're going to be looking at things like leaf removal early on. And if in the literature, we talk about leaf removal as occurring anywhere from about fruit set up to veraison. But in reality, the earlier you can do it, the further away from veraison you can get when you remove leaves, the better off you're going to be. And the reason for that is if you wait too late in the season and then you start pulling leaves and you expose a cluster of fruit to sunlight where it hasn't had that in a while, you're going to run more risk of sun scald that's going to detract from that cluster. So a lot of times we're going to be removing fruit shortly at bloom, and generally leaf removal involves taking 2 or 3 leaves off right in the cluster zone. Now, on as far as what varieties and what type of grapes do we do it on, generally we do for the white grape, we start looking, we have different parameters than red grapes. In some of the more sensitive white grape varieties, you may not want to do any leaf removal because you don't want sun scald to be an issue. On others, we're always more conscious of sun scald potential on whites than we are on reds. And so we may remove only on one side of the vine. And generally on a north-south oriented row, we'll remove the leaves on the north side of the row, or I'm sorry, on the east side of the north-south row. And that way we get the morning sun on the clusters, but we don't have the more intense afternoon sun, and it tends to protect the clusters from sun scald somewhat. And that's on a white. On a red, we're not quite as concerned. We might remove on both sides, and that'll give us better exposure of those clusters to sunlight morning and night. But if you have too much sun, too intensive sun on a white, sun scald can be the penalty that you pay. So leaf removal is one of the things that we might do. And of course, depends on the size of the vineyard, whether it's a hand removal operation or whether you can mechanize. There are some machines out that will help in speeding up leaf removal, but it can be an important part of our canopy management program. Another thing we look at is that we've got a lot of intense growth in the vine. This row is quite different than, say, the one next to us, but we've got tremendous cane growth here. And we want to make sure that we open those cane, our clusters up to sunlight, but yet we don't want to get over carried away on our leaf thinning or our shoot removal, because you've got to have leaf area to feed these clusters to develop the crop. And so as a rule, we say it takes about 15 leaves to develop a crop or a cluster of grapes. And so we may look at how much growth we've got on a shoot, and we may end up having to do some shoot pruning or entire shoot removal. And so if you look inside the canopy of a grapevine, and it depends a lot on the type of grape you're growing, and the type of wine that's being made on the grape. But you can see here we've got 2 clusters of grapes coming off of this shoot, and then we've got another shoot here that comes off the same spur, has no fruit on it. And so, you know, initially we might come in and say that, okay, we want to maintain the fruit, and we'll get rid of the non-fruitful shoot. And just doing that itself will open up a little bit more sunlight penetration into the canopy. And notice that we had 2 shoots coming off of the same spur. If both of those shoots had fruit on them, what we probably would do would be picking the lowest shoot coming off that had fruit to retain, and cutting off the upper shoot, so that next fall or next winter, when we prune and we start selecting our spurs and cutting back our spurs, we're going to be able to keep our cropping area more in the vicinity of the cordon. And so that's why I selected this shoot to get rid of. It was further away from the cordon. It also was not fruitful. Now, this has got 2 clusters of fruit on it, and that may be fine, because with the vigor you've got here, I can see this handling these clusters quite well. But if you didn't have this much vigor, or if you were making a premium wine out of this grape, you may elect to get rid of one of those clusters and just thin down to 1 cluster per shoot. And in which case, you know, either one of these could go, but we'll retain both of them, because again, we've got a lot of vigor on this vine, and I think it can hold it and develop a good quality grape. If we had 3 clusters, I would be inclined to take one of them off. We'd like to be able to develop good quality fruit. Our goal in growing fruit is to get good yields of high quality fruit on a consistent basis. And so we can crop this vine very heavily this year, but there comes a point when we crop it heavy, we're doing so at the expense of next year's crop. And I know earlier you had told me about your experiences with just that very thing. So what we want to do is have a manageable crop so we can get our maximum quality and good yields, but we want to be able to do it year after year after year. And so cutting back and adjusting the crop load in regards to the quality or the canopy ability to maintain that crop is very important. Another thing that we do in canopy management is we'll shoot position. That is, we don't want to have canes running all over the place, where if you've got canes that are crossing over, you get a lot of mutual shading within the canopy, and that means you're going to have more internal shading and more problems associated with that. So now with your trellis and training system here, you're going to a vertical shoot positioning type of trellis. You'll be looking at using the catch wires to maintain some of these canes. And then when you get up a certain height above the highest catch wire, you're going to be coming back and tipping the cane so that they don't droop over and once again shade the fruiting zone. So, you know, canopy or shoot manipulation as well as some tipping is going to be a part of our canopy management program. And I tipped up above the wire a few inches, but not so far that we're going to see it coming back over and shading out the fruit zone. What we would like to do is have this fruit well exposed to sunlight as we go along. So that's kind of the canopy management we look here. One thing that complicates this type of system a little bit is if you get into tissue analysis. You know, from a nutritional standpoint, tissue analysis can tell us a lot about the true nutrient status of the grapevine. In grapes, we generally recommend that we pull our tissue samples either at full bloom or as we get approach veraison. And at full bloom, we pull the leaf opposite the basal cluster on a vine. But as we get on up later in the season, if we wanted to pull at the later date, the recommendation is to pull the most recently matured leaf on a shoot. The problem with tipping is now you don't know where that most recently matured leaf is. It's gone. And so we do sacrifice that last or second window for our tissue analysis if we have to tip. If we were in a high wire system, we would be, of course, fruiting up here, and we would try to comb our shoots so they didn't cross over, but they would hang down free and give us a wall of foliage down. And if we do that correctly, we'll have better avenues for light and spray and air penetration within the canopy, and we won't have as much mutual shading as we would if we had new shoot growth crisscrossing of the vine. So combing in and positioning these canes on a high wire system with a variety that has a drooping growth habit would be an important production practice. And I might point out with them, if you had real vigorous growth that you were pushing down, and once you got down close to the ground, as long as you had the necessary amount of foliage that you need to support that cluster of fruit, there's absolutely no problem with coming in and cutting back a cane to keep it up off the ground to give you air circulation around the grapevine. I really believe that good management where you've got good air circulation around the vine is going to play a tremendous part in your ability to control a lot of the diseases that you have to contend with.
When we put these out, we put our wires 42 inches, and since then I'm putting them at 44 inches just so we can get airflow under the vine. I think it cuts down on disease management.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it also is going to help you a lot on grape root borer. You know, we've got grape root borer in most places in the state. The grape root borer will spend most of its life feeding on the roots of a grapevine, but as you get on up into July to early August, they come up out of the soil and they mate. The female lays eggs, the eggs hatch, and the larvae drop to the soil and go in and invade the nearest grapefruits they come to. The higher the canopy, the better sunlight penetration you've got to the ground underneath, the greater the mortality you have on those larvae. And that's important because once they get in the soil and establish a feeding site, they're going to be there for the next 2 years. You're not going to be able to control them. So I like the idea of moving it on up and then having catch wires up here to maintain a narrow canopy of foliage so that you've got well exposed fruit, but yet you've got ample leaf also well exposed to the sunlight so you can maximize the productive potential of the vine. So that's we kind of cheated on this because this is one of the nicer vines. It's a little bit tamer, I guess you would say, in the vineyard than something like Traminette. Yeah, I know you'd mentioned that's kind of a wildcat for you.
It's a very vigorous vine. The only way we can control that some is let it have more fruit.
Yes, and I think you bring up a real good point because when we talk about adjusting the crop load, uh, there's no really good, you can't say one number and have it applicable to all situations. You look at the variety, you look at the soils, you look at the training system that's being utilized, and you work within those parameters. And yes, when you've got a vigorous vine, you need to hang more fruit on it to try to divert some of that vigor into fruit production. So I agree with what you say in there 100%. Now, one of the things I like to do too is I'm going through and doing some canopy management. We'll address things like if we've got suckering off the trunk down below our fruiting cordons, I like to get rid of that. Again, that helps you with the air circulation. How you do it, you know, theoretically on shoot removal, uh, the you don't want to do it real early. That is, if you remove shoots in when the buds are just starting to break and grow, you actually end up working against yourself. The shoots that remain are going to be more vigorous than if you had left more shoots growing. And the reason for that is that initial flush of growth is coming off of stored reserves within the vine from last fall. and most of that's in the above ground portions of vine. So there's a limited amount of energy, and the fewer growing points that you have to absorb that energy, the more growth you're going to get in each point. And so if you delay your shoot removal until after the shoots are up, perhaps 4 or 6 inches long, you've depleted a lot of that stored energy, and the newer leaves on the basal part of that new shoot are now getting to about the point where they're contributing to the plant growth. Once a grape leaf hits about 50% of its final size, it's photosynthetically contributing to development of the above ground part or the terminal parts of the shoot. So by waiting until we get several inches of growth to come in and thin the shoots, we're not going to invigorate the shoots by taking out some of the non-fruitful ones. We've exhausted that stored energy. And so normally, again, let them grow a little bit, but if you can catch them when they're fairly small and you take off a shoot, it's better in many cases to go in and pull it off, and that succulent shoot will pull pretty easy than it is to cut it. Because when you cut off a shoot, what you might end up doing is releasing several buds at the base of that shoot, and now you've got a worse situation you ever had, because you, instead of having one shoot, now you got 4 or 5 come to take its place. But if you let it get up a ways where it's still succulent and you pull it, you tend to destroy the buds at the basal part of that shoot, and you don't get the replacement growth. You can't wait too long, because once that starts to lignify and get a little bit woody and you try to pull it, now you're going to do some damage to the vine. You make a bigger wound that's going to take longer to heal, and that creates its own set of problems. So, you know, the problem is to do a lot of this stuff, you got a very narrow window, and that becomes a kind of a labor nightmare. But so that's a little bit on our canopy management here. We've got, I know on down the road, you got some other vines that one of the canopy management things you might look at would be to go in and where you've got ample shoots coming out into the row, as well as your canopy extension, doing some hedging to get rid of some of this growth and opening this up again to more light. A lot of times when we hedge, though, that's a preliminary operation. It kind of sets a pattern. And then ideally, we would like to follow up with maybe some hand shears or something to kind of refine our hedging operation. Notice I said that's ideally. Now, and realistically, again, you may not be able to do all of that simply because the time demands, but hedging can be an effective way to open up this canopy for better light. Okay. So if you wanted, we could step into another variety. You want to go on down to the Traminette, maybe?
That'll be another challenge.
I really like the looks. The foliage has got a good color. I mean, it's obvious that nitrogen is not a problem, but yet it's not. You don't see the real dark green that would indicate that you're in a over nitrogen situation. So this is Traminette, right?
Traminette.
Okay, and you might tell us a little bit about your experiences with Traminette wall.
Traminette is a very vigorous vine, and in the summertime we just
Look closer to him.
in the summertime when we prune to do the summer pruning, you can't walk behind this. There's so much foliage there, and so what I decided to do was let it have more fruit, so it puts less into the growth of the vine and more into more fruit, which is what I'm trying to produce here anyway. But I really like the vine. It's the same age as the Chardonnay. That's about a 15-year-old vine.
Okay. Yeah, and it's got nice leaf color. One of the things that of course everything's related in what we do. And if you have a spring like we had last year, and in many areas like we saw this year, where we had late frost events coming in that takes out some of our primaries, some of these varieties that are not necessarily very fruitful on secondaries don't have a lot of crop to absorb some of that vigor. And so it may be even more important this year to come in and do some of your hedging work to get rid of some of this foliage, to narrow up the canopy some so that we get sunlight in, but also, of course, to maintain as much fruit as we can because, well, the name of the game is getting a good crop. So again, we're looking at shoot removal if necessary, and early shoot removal. And then also, if we have to, we adjust the crop load. Here we've got multiple shoots coming in and a little bit too much where you see all these well, multiple shoots coming off at the same point. It really would be to our benefit to get rid of some of this, to decrease the competition for light. Earlier on, it might leaf thinning would be a little bit more of an issue, but we're also going to be conscious of the fact that we don't want to open this up to too much light where we're going to get sun scald issues. So shoot positioning, tucking in around our catch wires is going to be important to maintain an effective canopy, yet not one that's going to shade the fruiting zone on the plant. And again, with a north-south oriented row on a white variety, we're a little bit more aggressive on things like leaf removal on the east side than what we would be on the west side. We're going to leave some protection from sun scald on this side of the vine. On a red, we might be removing leaves over here as well. But again, a nice narrow canopy and trying to tuck our new growth up to get rid of some of the shade. And also, it's going to make it easier all the way up through harvest if we've got our fruit pretty much out in an exposed situation. So with something like Traminette, with the vigor you've got here, you could very effectively run down through with a hedger and take off a lot of this, and you've got ample shoot growth to give you the support you need for the crop that's on the vine.
That's usually what we do. We usually hedge these, and it makes quite a pile.
Right.
A lot of vegetation.
One of the problems you've got here, I know in our discussions, you're not putting any nitrogen down because the soils that you're on are supplying all the nitrogen you need and then some. And so one of the adjustments, or one of our controls that we have in some vineyards, are not an option for you. Your option is crop load. When Mother Nature kind of messes us up like it did a little bit this year, that's taken away some of the handles. So we've got to make adjustments. But realize with grapes, like a lot of other fruits, that the fruit buds for next year are being formed now, and we don't want to do anything that would compromise those. We want to maintain a good quality canopy all the way through harvest, and actually all the way up to natural leaf drop, because as after harvest especially, that leaf is exporting photosynthase back to the woody tissues and storing the energy in the woody tissues and buds, primarily in the above ground part of the vine. That's helping that vine to get through the winter better, and also to get off to a better start with that first flush of growth next year. So that's pretty much what we're looking at right now on Traminette. Again, it would be nice if we could do a lot of our shoot growth or our shoot management before the tendrils got out and started wrapping up. They slow down the process and make the process a lot more difficult, but there's just so many things you can do. So by getting the shoots up and opening up that the zone, the fruiting zone, is going to be important. Putting our shoots up between the catch wires, and then if necessary, again, we can still do some leaf removal in the fruit zone, but we don't want to be too aggressive. We don't want to create problems by getting into sun scald issues on the crop. But if we can just open it up just a bit, and again, it doesn't take many leaves to be removed in this area to make a tremendous amount of difference in the light that's getting to these clusters and the spray coverage that you get when you come through. You know, even with an air blast, which is the ideal sprayer, I think, when you come by and you hit this leaf, I mean, we've got a pretty big leaf, but if it just pushes it back against the cluster, you don't get the total coverage that you would like to see. And so by not having that big leaf cover in front of that cluster, we're going to do a better job getting coverage. And definitely early in the development of these berries, we want to make sure that we're on top of things like mildew, which can come back and haunt us later in the season if we don't do a good job early. So with that, yeah, are there any questions so far that we could hopefully answer? We are looking at now, you know, a long-term idea of when we're cutting in here and selecting shoots to leave. We're also keeping in mind on where we're going to be pruning to next year for our spurs and the length of the spurs and the development. In an ideal scenario, and again, realize that a grapevine is a biological organism, and therefore variation is the name of the game. But ideally, as you go down the wire, you would like to have shoots about every 4 to 6 inches. And so when we shoot thin, that's one of the criteria we look at. And another one, of course, is just going to be where the most fruitful shoots are. Any of the old wood that we can cut out, the better off we can be on, say, on disease removal or prevention. But again, what we'd like to do is get as much light into the fruiting zone as we can. A little complicated this year with crop loss, but still, it's going to be a factor that we've got to be cognizant of when we handle the canopies.
Any questions come through?
You've got some Chamberson a little bit over? Is that?
We've got some Chamberson over there. It's heavily loaded.
Okay, that we might want to look at that.
Let's go look at it.
No, a while ago when we were talking about the varieties you had, and you mentioned you had Chamberson, and basically, I think you referred to it as your workhorse red. I noticed last year where we had a lot of cold injury late, Chamberson came through in many vineyards much better. As a rule, the French American hybrids tend to be more fruitful on secondary buds than, say, Americans or vinifers. But within the French American hybrids, there's still a pretty wide spread. In whites, it's been my experience that Saval is one of the most fruitful on secondaries, but Chamberson is shown to be that way in many cases on the reds. So it appears again that we've come through a bad crop situation from a frost standpoint with a lot of fruit. And what Walt's doing now, that is removing the shoots down low on the trunk below the fruiting wire, is very important because, again, that's going to complicate spray coverage or air drainage. And so getting rid of that and moving our focus on up into the canopy is going to be important. There's a lot of fruit in it. And how much fruit do you want is going to depend a lot on the variety. Chamberson will support a pretty good crop and it'll come back with us. But still, if we can come through and identify some canes that are not going to be as desirable as others, perhaps we can be a little bit, we can increase our fruit quality a little bit. So what we're trying to do here is just to come back in and do some shoot removal and get rid of some of the excess growth to try to keep more sunlight in. We're going to be tucking shoots up in our catch wires and trying to expose our foliage to, or our fruit to more sunlight. But then too, when you start looking at an individual shoot,
Would you take this one right here off?
yes, sir, I would. And it's a good point. I think when you start to look at a shoot coming off the side or off the lower part of a cordon, I think it's going to give you poor quality fruit and less fruit. And so trying to focus our fruiting zone on the upper part of the cordon, I think is going to be better. When you get a lot of fruit on a given shoot, you're going to have to do a little bit of manipulation. Here we've got a shoot coming off that, well, we got several shoots crossing, but we're going to have to thin it somewhat. And that unfortunately means we're going to be taking some fruit off. But again, we're trying to let light in. We're going to remove some of the shoots that don't offer a lot of return cropping potential. And hopefully we can maximize the amount of fruit that we've got left that will be well exposed to sunlight. So on a red, again, we can do a little bit more aggressive leaf removal in the fruit zone than we would on a white on both sides of the trellis, because sun scald is not as big an issue. However, it's not something we want to neglect altogether. We've got a lot of growth in here that we can clean up some. So you see, we're letting more light in, but we don't want to, we don't want to overcrop a given shoot. So if you've got a shoot that's got multiple clusters on it, and this one, for example, has got 2 good sized clusters, it probably can't handle that as well as we'd like to see. And so in a situation like that, it would be probably worth your while to come back to just a single cluster, or maybe even removal of a shoulder on the clusters to get rid of a little bit of that fruit load. We don't know what the rest of the summer's got in store for us as far as our fruiting capabilities, but hopefully it'll be fairly good, and we'll maintain a pretty good growth of the crop as the rest of the year. There's a lot of fruit in here. There still may be too much, and it may well be that as the summer progresses, we're going to come back and do a little bit more aggressive thinning to adjust our crop load. But the better light, the better spray, the better air circulation through the canopy, the better the crop's going to be. So that, again, that's the way I would look at it. I think that it takes a long time to go through and to prepare the canopy the way we'd like it, but it will definitely be a good production practice as far as assuring the quality of the crop that we want to have to make the good wines that our wineries are making.
Any questions? Do I ask any questions?
Are there any questions that hopefully we could answer?
Let me see. Hey, can anybody hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Hey, I want to ask you now, is it true that you have to have 12 leaves on a vine to give sugar to the grape?
Okay, the question is it true that you have to have 12 leaves on a vine or on a shoot to give sugars in the grape? And it's true that you'd have to have a certain number of leaves on a shoot to support the development of that cluster. And so whether it's 12 leaves on some or 15 leaves on another, number in there, and if you've got good quality foliage, there's going to be an ideal number for that. Realize that as the shoot grows, the leaves that are close to the cluster are going to be transporting a lot of their photosynthetates toward development of the cluster, whereas leaves that are on up here are going to be transporting their energy on up to continue the new shoot growth. I mentioned it before, I think, that once a leaf gets about 50% full size, it becomes a net exporter of photosynthetates. In the upper part of a shoot, it goes to the new growth, and then more and more it'll focus on the cluster as we approach harvest. And if we have too few leaves, then we're going to sacrifice sugar development, color development, and we'll have adverse effects on wine quality and next year's crop as a result. So yeah, you need to have a fairly good number of functional leaves to carry that crop through to fruition.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
All
Okay. Well, and I thank you, Walt, for allowing us to come out to your vineyard today, and thanks for arranging the nice weather.
We do